The Quiet Promise. The morning light slid gently across the hardwood floor of a quiet Lowe's Angels home, stopping just short of a man seated alone at the kitchen table. Keanu Reeves sat motionless, his hands wrapped loosely around a mug that had long since gone cold. Outside, the city was awake. Cars murmured in the distance, a helicopter traced a slow arc across the sky. But inside, time seemed to pause. On the table in front of him lay a slim leather notebook, its edges worn, its pages filled not with scripts or schedules, but with memories he had never meant for the world to see. At the very top of the first page, written in careful ink, was a single name: Sandra Bullock. He did not open the notebook right away. Instead, he stared at it as though it might speak first, as though the quiet between them was part of a conversation that had been going on for decades. Keanu had learned long ago that some relationships did not need constant words to survive. Some were built in glances exchanged across crowded rooms, in late-night phone calls that ended with shared laughter and no clear reason, in a sense of understanding that felt older than memory itself. His connection with Sandra had always been like that, unlabeled, unforced, and deeply human. Their story, at least the part the public thought it knew, began years ago under the glare of Hollywood lights. They were young then, still discovering who they were beneath the cameras, still surprised by how quickly life could change. On set, Sandra's energy filled every corner of the room, her laughter carrying easily over the noise of production. Keanu, quieter by nature, often found himself standing slightly apart, observing, absorbing, listening. Yet somehow, without either of them ever naming it, they met in the middle. Where she brought warmth, he brought calm. Where she moved fast, he steadied the ground beneath her feet. It was never a performance. It was simply who they were. As the years passed, their careers grew, their paths crossed and separated, and the world added its own interpretations to their bond. Rumors came and went, headlines bloomed and faded, but beneath all of that noise remained something far simpler and far more enduring: respect. They showed up for each other quietly in ways that never made the news. A message sent at just the right moment. A visit made without cameras. A shared silence that said more than any speech ever could. They did not need to explain themselves, and perhaps that was why what they had felt so rare. Keanu picked up the notebook at last, turning it slowly in his hands. He remembered a particular afternoon years earlier, long after one of their projects together had wrapped, when they sat on opposite ends of a bench outside a studio. The sun had been low, the kind of light that makes everything feel temporary and precious at the same time. Sandra had been unusually quiet that day, her smile softer, her eyes distant. She spoke about kindness then, not as a grand idea, but as a daily choice. "It's the only thing that lasts," she had said, almost to herself. "Not awards, not applause, just how you make people feel when no one's watching." He hadn't responded right away, but the words had stayed with him, settling somewhere deep, shaping the way he moved through the world. Time, however, has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Life grew heavier, responsibilities multiplied. Losses arrived quietly and left scars that did not show on red carpets. Sandra, ever private about her pain, began to pull back from the public eye, choosing instead to focus on her family, her inner circle, and the causes that mattered to her most. Keanu understood this instinctively. He had always believed that some seasons of life were meant to be lived offstage. They spoke less during that time, but when they did, there was no awkwardness, no need to catch up on everything that had been missed. It felt as though no time had passed at all. Then came the news that shifted something deep inside him, the kind of news that arrives not as a loud interruption but as a quiet fracture. Sandra had stepped away even further, seeking rest, seeking balance, seeking peace. There were whispers, but Keanu ignored them. He knew better than to confuse speculation with truth. What mattered was the sense, difficult to explain and impossible to ignore, that something precious was changing. That same evening, he opened the notebook for the first time in years and began to write. Not for an audience, not for history, but for her. What he wrote was not a declaration or a farewell. It was a record of gratitude. He wrote about moments that only the two of them would recognize, about lessons learned simply by watching her move through the world with empathy and courage. He wrote about the way her kindness had recalibrated his understanding of success, about how she had reminded him that gentleness could be a form of strength. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it carefully in a drawer, unsure if she would ever read it, but certain that the act of writing it mattered. Weeks later, when the inevitable loss came, it did so without spectacle. The world reacted as it always does, with shock and sorrow expressed in headlines and tributes, but Keanu experienced it differently. For him, grief was not loud. It did not demand attention. It arrived as a stillness, a weight that settled into ordinary moments, the empty chair across from him, the absence of a familiar voice, the sudden realization that there would be no more new memories to add to the old ones. He did not speak publicly. He did not explain his silence. He simply carried on, holding close what could not be replaced. In the months that followed, something else began to take shape alongside his grief. A question, quiet but persistent, returned to him again and again. What does it mean to honor someone who believed so deeply in kindness? Flowers faded. Words lost their edge. He knew that whatever he did, it could not be performative. It had to be lived. Slowly, an idea formed, not grand, not attention-seeking, but intentional. A gesture that reflected who Sandra had been when no one was watching. A way of turning memory into movement. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Keanu stood by the window with the notebook open in his hands. He read the words he had written months earlier and felt something settle into place. This would not be a story about loss, he realized. It would be a story about continuity, about carrying forward the values that mattered long after the person who taught them was gone. He closed the notebook, his resolve quiet but firm, and whispered into the stillness, as if she might hear him wherever she was. "I'll take care of it." What he did not yet know was that this promise, simple, unspoken, and deeply personal, would grow beyond anything he imagined. That his decision to honor her in silence would eventually ripple outward, touching lives far removed from Hollywood, far removed from fame. And as the night settled over the city, Keanu Reeves took the first step on a path that would transform memory into legacy, not through spectacle, but through the same quiet kindness that had defined their bond from the very beginning. The shape of what remains. In the weeks after that quiet promise, Keanu Reeves found himself moving through his days with an unusual awareness, as if every small action now carried extra weight. He noticed the way people avoided eye contact on crowded sidewalks, the way a tired barista's shoulders relaxed when he said thank you and meant it, the way silence could feel either empty or full depending on how you treated it. These observations were not new to him, but now they felt sharpened, illuminated by memory. Everywhere he went, he saw traces of Sandra Bullock, not in faces or voices, but in moments where kindness could have been ignored and instead was chosen. It struck him that grief did not only take things away, sometimes it clarified what mattered most. He did not rush into action. That had never been his way. Instead, he allowed the idea he carried to sit with him, to evolve naturally, much like a script that reveals its true meaning only after multiple readings. Late at night, when the city softened and distractions fell away, he revisited old memories with a different lens. He remembered Sandra's habit of listening fully, of leaning in when someone spoke as if nothing else in the world deserved her attention at that moment. He remembered how she avoided grand gestures, preferring small, intentional acts that left lasting impressions. The tribute he envisioned could not be loud. It could not announce itself. It had to exist quietly, doing its work without asking for recognition, the way she had always lived. As days turned into months, Keanu began to ask questions, not of the media, not of industry colleagues, but of himself. What kind of legacy could truly reflect a person who believed that kindness was a daily discipline rather than a performance? He read about causes she had supported privately, places she had visited without press releases, children she had met without cameras. Each discovery reinforced the same truth. Sandra had never needed applause to act with compassion. That understanding became his compass. Whatever he chose to do, it would mirror that philosophy or not exist at all. During this time, he kept a low profile, continuing his work with the same humility that had always defined him. On set, he treated crew members with the same respect as directors, listened more than he spoke, and offered help without fanfare. Some noticed a change, not in his demeanor but in his focus. There was a steadiness about him, a sense that he was carrying something important just beneath the surface. No one asked directly, and he was grateful for that. Certain things, he believed, grew best in silence. One evening, while walking alone through a quiet neighborhood, Keanu paused in front of a small community garden tucked between apartment buildings. It was modest, nothing like the manicured green spaces of wealthier areas, but it was alive with care. Hand-painted signs marked rows of vegetables, and children's drawings were taped to a nearby fence faded slightly by the sun. An elderly man knelt in the dirt, carefully tending to a plant, humming softly as he worked. The scene stopped Keanu in his tracks. There was no audience, no reward, just effort given freely for the benefit of others. He felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. This, he thought, this is what she meant. That night the idea finally took shape in a way that felt right. It would not be a monument to fame, nor a gesture tied to his own name. It would be something living, something that gave back continuously rather than marking an ending. He envisioned a space that offered comfort and possibility to those who needed it most, a place where creativity and healing could coexist, where children could find light during moments of fear and uncertainty. The thought brought him a rare sense of calm. For the first time since her passing, he felt he was moving forward rather than simply enduring. The process began quietly. He reached out to people he trusted, not with grand explanations but with simple questions. He listened carefully to doctors, educators, and community workers, absorbing their insights and learning where help was most needed. At every step, he asked himself a single question: would this feel true to her? If the answer was uncertain, he paused. There was no deadline. This was not a project to be rushed. It was a continuation of a conversation that had never really ended. Throughout this period, the notebook remained close at hand. He added to it occasionally, jotting down thoughts, observations, fragments of memory. It became less a letter and more a map, guiding him through moments of doubt. When he felt overwhelmed by the scale of what he hoped to do, he reminded himself that Sandra had always believed in starting small. Change, she had once told him, rarely arrived all at once. It accumulated, built from countless unseen choices made by ordinary people who refused to look away. There were moments, of course, when the weight of absence pressed heavily against him. In quiet rooms and empty evenings, he felt the familiar ache of wanting to share progress with her, to hear her laugh at his overthinking, to receive her gentle reassurance that he was on the right track. During those times, he returned to the simple acts that had always grounded him: walking, reading, listening. He learned that honoring someone did not require constant action. Sometimes it meant allowing yourself to feel fully, without distraction or denial. Gradually, the outline of his tribute became clearer, not as a finished plan, but as an intention rooted in values rather than outcomes. It would exist to serve, not to symbolize. It would invite participation rather than admiration. And most importantly, it would carry forward the belief that kindness, when practiced consistently and without expectation, could transform lives in ways no headline ever could. This understanding did not erase his grief, but it gave it direction, turning pain into purpose. As winter gave way to early spring, Keanu stood one morning at the edge of a quiet park, watching sunlight filter through bare branches just beginning to show signs of renewal. Children's voices echoed faintly in the distance, and for a moment, he imagined Sandra standing beside him, observing the scene with that familiar half-smile, the one that suggested she saw beauty where others saw routine. He did not speak aloud, but he felt a sense of agreement settle within him, as if the path ahead had been acknowledged. What lay before him would take time, patience, and careful thought, but he no longer felt alone in the effort. The promise he had made was no longer just a private vow. It was becoming a way of moving through the world with renewed intention. And as he turned away from the park and continued on his walk, Keanu Reeves carried with him the quiet certainty that legacy was not something you left behind. It was something you lived, one deliberate choice at a time. Where silence becomes action. By the time spring had settled fully into the city, Keanu Reeves had come to understand that intention alone was not enough. Intention needed a vessel, a form sturdy enough to carry meaning without distorting it. He felt this most strongly during a visit to a children's medical center far from the Hollywood Hills, a place he entered without announcement, dressed simply, asking for nothing more than permission to observe. The corridors were painted in cheerful colors meant to soften fear, yet beneath the brightness lingered a quiet gravity that only those who had spent time there could recognize. Children moved through those halls with a bravery that felt both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring, and as he watched them, he remembered how Sandra Bullock had once spoken about courage, not as the absence of fear, but as the choice to keep imagining joy even when fear was present. Standing there, he realized that any tribute worthy of her would need to do more than remember. It would need to serve. He did not announce his plans to anyone that day, but something shifted inside him as he left the building and stepped back into the open air. The idea he had been carrying was no longer abstract. It had a direction now, shaped by the faces he had seen and the stories he had quietly absorbed. He began to envision a space where children could reconnect with something beyond illness or limitation, a place where imagination was treated as a form of medicine and creativity as a bridge back to hope. It would not be a grand institution or a spectacle of generosity. It would be intentional, grounded, and deeply human, the way Sandra herself had always been. As the weeks passed, Keanu moved carefully, almost deliberately slowly, assembling a small circle of collaborators who understood discretion and purpose. He spoke to architects who valued harmony over grandeur, to educators who believed learning extended beyond classrooms, and to artists who understood that beauty could be a source of healing rather than decoration. In every conversation, he avoided using Sandra's name at first, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. He wanted the foundation of the idea to stand on its own before it was associated with any legacy. Only when he felt certain that their values aligned did he share the deeper motivation behind the project, and each time he did, he noticed the same reaction, a quiet pause followed by a soft nod of understanding. During this period, Keanu often returned to a familiar habit, riding through the city on his motorcycle late at night, when traffic thinned and the world felt less demanding. These rides had always been a way for him to think, to let thoughts arrange themselves without force. On one such night, stopped at a red light beneath a flickering street lamp, he found himself reflecting on how easily grief could turn inward, becoming isolating and heavy. Sandra had never allowed that to happen to her, even in her hardest moments. She had always believed that pain, when shared thoughtfully, could become a source of connection rather than separation. That belief now guided him. This tribute would not be something he carried alone. It would invite others to participate in kindness, to extend it in their own ways. Slowly, the project began to take physical form. A location was chosen with care, not for prestige, but for accessibility, close to a community that needed it. Plans were drawn that prioritized natural light, open spaces, and areas where children could create freely without instruction or expectation. There would be walls for painting, shelves for books, quiet corners for reflection, and outdoor areas where laughter could spill into the air without restraint. Each detail felt like a conversation with the past, an unspoken agreement to honor Sandra's belief that environments shape how people feel and how they heal. Throughout it all, Keanu resisted the urge to intervene unnecessarily. He trusted the people he had brought together, offering guidance when asked, but allowing the work to unfold organically. This restraint was not indifference, it was faith. Faith that the values he and Sandra had shared could live on through others without his constant presence. There were moments when he felt the familiar pull of doubt, when he wondered if he was doing enough or if he was somehow misrepresenting her spirit. In those moments, he returned to the notebook, rereading passages that reminded him why he had begun this journey in the first place. Each word felt less like memory and more like instruction. As construction progressed, Keanu visited the site quietly, often alone, walking through unfinished rooms and imagining the life they would soon hold. He pictured children laughing, parents exhaling tension they hadn't realized they were carrying, and volunteers finding renewed purpose in simple acts of care. These images did not erase his grief, but they softened it, transforming it into something active rather than static. He began to understand that honoring Sandra did not mean preserving her exactly as she had been. It meant allowing her values to evolve and reach people she would never meet. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the skeletal frame of what would soon become a central gathering space, Keanu stood still, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood. For a fleeting moment, he felt a sense of alignment so complete it startled him, as though everything, past, present, and future, had briefly settled into harmony. He did not attribute this feeling to anything supernatural. Instead, he recognized it as the quiet satisfaction that comes from acting in accordance with one's deepest values. It was the same feeling he had experienced years earlier on set with Sandra, when a scene landed not because of technical perfection, but because it felt true. As the day faded, he left the site without ceremony, content to let the work continue without him. The tribute was no longer an idea waiting for permission. It was becoming a living extension of kindness, one that would soon belong to many rather than one. And as Keanu rode away into the evening, he carried with him a growing certainty that the legacy he was helping shape did not rely on remembrance alone. It relied on participation, on the willingness of ordinary people to choose empathy again and again. In that understanding, he felt closer to Sandra than he had since her passing, not because he was holding on, but because he was finally letting her light move forward. The moment the world began to feel it. By early summer, the project that Keanu Reeves had nurtured in silence reached a stage where it could no longer be described as merely an idea in motion. The building stood complete now, not imposing or extravagant, but quietly welcoming, as though it had always belonged to the land beneath it. Sunlight poured through wide windows, settling softly on wooden floors and open walls designed to hold color, laughter, and the unfiltered imagination of children who had learned too early how fragile life could be. Walking through the space for the first time after its completion, Keanu felt a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability, the kind that comes when something deeply personal steps beyond the boundaries of privacy and begins to exist in the real world. This place carried her spirit, he thought, not as a memory frozen in time, but as a presence meant to keep moving. He did not attend the opening in any official capacity. There were no speeches from him, no acknowledgments, no explanation of why the building existed or who had made it possible. Instead, he arrived quietly early in the morning before the doors opened, standing alone in the central hall while the day's first light stretched across the walls. In that stillness, he felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The conversations left unfinished, the words written only for himself, the promise made in a room full of silence. He did not expect closure. He had learned that grief rarely offers something so tidy. What he felt instead was continuity, the sense that something meaningful had crossed a threshold and could now live without his constant guidance. As families began to arrive, the space filled gradually with sound and motion. Children moved hesitantly at first, unsure whether this was another place of rules and limitations, but their caution dissolved quickly as they discovered paint waiting to be touched, books waiting to be opened, and corners designed not for treatment but for wonder. Keanu observed from a distance, blending into the background, watching as a young boy with a shy smile dipped his fingers into bright colors and laughed when they splashed unexpectedly across the page. That laugh struck him with surprising force. It carried the same warmth he had once heard in Sandra Bullock, the same reminder that joy did not need permission to exist, even in places marked by hardship. Word spread quietly at first, carried not by press releases but by gratitude. Parents spoke to other parents. Volunteers told friends. Doctors noticed changes in their patients' moods and shared stories with colleagues. The building became more than a facility. It became a pause in the middle of fear, a reminder that life could still offer moments of light. Keanu heard these stories secondhand, often weeks later, and each one reaffirmed his belief that he had chosen the right path. He resisted the urge to step forward, to explain, to contextualize. The work was doing exactly what it was meant to do without him. Inevitably, curiosity followed impact. People began to ask questions, not aggressively, not suspiciously, but with genuine wonder. Who had funded this place? Why was there no name attached? The absence of answers only deepened interest, and speculation crept in cautiously, as it always does. Keanu was aware of this shift, but he did not intervene. He trusted that the truth, if it emerged, would do so in its own time and on its own terms. Sandra had always believed that intention mattered more than recognition, and he held tightly to that principle now. Despite his efforts to remain invisible, moments arose that tested his resolve. One afternoon, while visiting the center quietly, he was approached by a young volunteer who recognized him, her eyes widening with surprise before softening with respect. She did not ask for a photo or an autograph. Instead, she thanked him, not for the building, which she did not know was his doing, but for simply being there, for taking the time to listen to a child who was struggling to articulate fear. That interaction stayed with him long after he left. It reminded him that presence itself could be a form of tribute, that honoring someone's legacy did not require grand gestures so much as consistency. As the center's influence grew, Keanu began to see something unexpected take shape alongside it. People inspired by the space began replicating its spirit elsewhere, organizing small creative corners in hospitals, libraries, and community centers, often without resources beyond donated time and materials. They did not wait for permission or guidance. They acted because they had felt something real and wanted to pass it on. This ripple effect moved him deeply. It echoed Sandra's belief that kindness multiplied when it was shared freely, without ownership or control. There were evenings when the magnitude of what was unfolding overwhelmed him. Sitting alone, he would replay moments from the past, wondering what she would say if she could see this now. He imagined her gentle amusement at the attention it was quietly receiving, her insistence that it was never about her, even as it carried her values so clearly. In those imagined conversations, he found reassurance. He realized that letting go of authorship did not diminish his connection to the work. It strengthened it, allowing the tribute to remain authentic rather than performative. Eventually, fragments of the story began to surface publicly, pieced together by those who had followed both of their careers closely. Articles appeared that spoke not of romance or spectacle, but of friendship, respect, and shared values. The tone surprised many. It was reflective, almost reverent, as if people sensed instinctively that this was not a narrative to be exploited. Keanu read these pieces quietly, grateful for their restraint. He did not correct inaccuracies or add detail. The essence was intact, and that was enough. Through it all, the center continued its work, day after day, untouched by speculation. Children returned again and again, claiming the space as their own. Parents spoke of subtle changes, renewed confidence, easier laughter, a willingness to imagine futures that had once felt unreachable. These stories reached Keanu not as headlines, but as whispered confirmations that the promise he had made was being kept, not by him alone, but by everyone who stepped inside and chose to participate. One evening, as he stood outside the building watching the lights glow warmly against the darkening sky, Keanu felt a quiet sense of completion that surprised him. Not an ending, but a settling, as though the story had found its rhythm and no longer needed his constant attention. He understood then that the most powerful tributes did not announce themselves. They lived, breathed, and grew in the hands of others, carrying forward the values that inspired them. And as he turned away and walked back into the night, he knew that Sandra's legacy was no longer something he protected. It was something the world had begun to carry on its own. When the quiet becomes a voice. By the time autumn arrived, Keanu Reeves began to sense that the tribute he had shaped in silence was gently asking to be understood, not explained, but acknowledged in a way that could help it travel further. The center had become a steady presence in the community, no longer new, no longer curious, simply there, a place people trusted. He noticed how routines formed around it, how families scheduled their days to include time inside those walls, how volunteers spoke of it not as a project but as a refuge. This was the moment he had hoped for, when the work no longer depended on his vigilance, when it breathed on its own. And yet, with that independence came a subtle responsibility, to ensure that its purpose would remain clear even as stories about it evolved. The first request came quietly, as most meaningful things do. A small group of educators reached out, asking if they could adapt the model for a network of rural schools that lacked access to creative resources. They were not asking for funding alone. They wanted guidance principles, something they could hold on to as they made choices in environments very different from the original space. Keanu listened carefully, aware that this was a threshold moment. He realized that protecting the integrity of Sandra's values did not mean guarding them. It meant articulating them clearly enough that others could carry them forward without distortion. For the first time, he considered the possibility that silence, while powerful, might need to give way to a measured voice. He began drafting a simple framework, not a manifesto or a brand, but a set of principles grounded in empathy and practicality. It spoke about accessibility over aesthetics, about participation over performance, about treating creativity as a shared human need rather than a luxury. Writing it felt different from the notebook entries he had kept for himself. This was outward-facing, shaped not by grief but by stewardship. As he worked, he felt the familiar presence of Sandra Bullock in the margins of his thoughts, not as a memory pulling him backward, but as a compass pointing forward. He could almost hear her reminding him to keep it simple, to trust people, to avoid anything that felt like self-importance. When the framework was shared, its reception surprised him. It did not spark headlines or debates, it sparked action. Communities adapted it quickly, translating its ideas into local languages and needs, finding their own expressions of the same core values. Keanu watched this unfold with a mixture of humility and awe. He had feared that speaking might dilute the work, but instead it clarified it, allowing others to participate with confidence rather than guesswork. In that clarity, he felt a quiet relief, as though a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged had finally released. There were still moments of discomfort. Invitations arrived, panels, interviews, public acknowledgments, many of which he declined politely. He did not want the focus to shift back to him, yet he also recognized that refusing every opportunity could limit the work's reach. After careful thought, he accepted one request that felt aligned: a closed conversation with community leaders and caregivers held without cameras or press. There he spoke not about grief, but about listening, about how honoring someone's legacy often means letting it change you before it changes anything else. His words were unadorned, grounded in lived experience rather than abstraction, and the response was immediate and deeply human. People shared their own stories of loss transformed into service, of pain redirected toward purpose. That evening, alone again, Keanu reflected on how far the journey had carried him from the quiet room where he had first made his promise. He realized that honoring someone was not a single act completed and set aside. It was a practice that required ongoing attention and humility. It meant being willing to adapt, to step forward when needed and step back when appropriate, to accept that legacy was not about control but about continuity. This understanding did not diminish the intimacy of his connection to Sandra. It expanded it, allowing her values to live through countless choices he would never see. As winter approached, the center prepared for a simple anniversary gathering, not a celebration, but a moment of gratitude for everyone who had contributed time, care, and imagination. Keanu attended briefly, standing at the edge of the room, listening as children described what the space meant to them in their own words. Their language was unpolished and sincere, full of metaphors drawn from paint and light and stories half-finished. One child said it was a place where fear felt smaller. Another said it was where colors made sense again. Keanu felt his throat tighten, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the truest measure of the tribute's success. When he left that night, the air crisp and clear, he did not feel the need to add anything else. The work was speaking now, not loudly, but unmistakably. He understood that the promise he had made had been kept not by closing a chapter, but by opening many others. And as he walked into the quiet street, he felt a deep, steady peace, the kind that comes when action aligns with memory and memory transforms into shared meaning. The tribute no longer belonged to him alone, and in that surrender, he found the final confirmation that he had honored her in the way she would have wanted, by letting kindness continue its work, unclaimed and enduring. The legacy that walks forward. As the year turned and winter settled softly over the city, Keanu found himself standing at a distance from everything he had helped set in motion, watching it continue without his guidance, without his presence, without even his name attached to it. This distance was not abandonment, it was trust. He had come to understand that the most honest form of tribute was not one that constantly looked backward, but one that moved forward with quiet confidence, carrying values rather than faces. In the stillness of those colder months, he reflected often on how grief had first narrowed his world and then, slowly and unexpectedly, expanded it. What had begun as a private promise made in silence had grown into a living network of care, creativity, and shared responsibility, and the realization filled him not with pride, but with a calm gratitude that settled deep in his chest. There were moments, walking alone through familiar streets or sitting quietly in rooms with nothing but his thoughts, when memories surfaced uninvited. Not the painful ones that demanded attention, but gentle fragments. A shared laugh after a long day, an offhand comment about how kindness should never feel heavy, the way Sandra had always believed that the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. These memories no longer pulled him into sorrow. Instead, they felt like guideposts, subtle reminders of how to move through the world with intention. He noticed that his own behavior had shifted almost imperceptibly. He listened longer. He spoke less. He chose patience even when urgency tempted him otherwise. In living differently, he realized he was honoring her more completely than any single project ever could. The work continued to evolve beyond what he could have planned. New spaces inspired by the original center appeared in places he had never visited, shaped by local hands and local needs, but united by a shared philosophy of care. He received letters occasionally, not addressed to him personally, but to the idea behind the work, messages of thanks written by parents, teachers, and volunteers who described small changes that felt monumental in their own contexts. He read these letters slowly, never all at once, allowing each story its own space to breathe. They confirmed something he had begun to suspect. That legacy was not a fixed thing you left behind, but a series of choices made by others who found meaning in what you started. One quiet afternoon, Keanu returned alone to the first space, not as a benefactor or guest, but simply as someone passing through. The walls bore new layers of color now, painted over countless times, each layer a record of imagination released rather than preserved. Children moved freely, some confident, some tentative, all absorbed in the act of creating. No one recognized him, and he did not correct that. He sat on a bench and watched, feeling a profound sense of rightness in his anonymity. This, he thought, was how it should be. The work did not need his face to validate it. It needed only the willingness of people to show up for one another. As he prepared to leave, a small moment caught his attention. A child who had been struggling to complete a drawing paused, took a breath, and tried again, encouraged quietly by another child nearby. There was no adult intervention, no instruction, just patience shared naturally. Keanu felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was the essence of everything Sandra had believed in, people lifting one another gently without being asked, without expecting credit. He realized then that the tribute had reached its most complete form, not in the building or the framework, but in moments like this, repeated endlessly and unnoticed. That evening, as he walked away, the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky, Keanu understood something that had eluded him at the beginning of his journey. Honoring someone's legacy did not require preserving them exactly as they were. It required allowing their influence to change you, and then trusting that change to ripple outward through your actions and the actions of others. In releasing control, he had found continuity. In stepping back, he had allowed something far larger than himself to move forward. Later that night, alone once more, he opened the old notebook for the final time. He did not add new words. He did not revise what was already there. He simply read, then closed it gently, feeling no need to carry it with him anymore. The promise it represented had been kept, not through completion, but through continuation. As he set the notebook aside, Keanu felt a quiet certainty settle over him, the kind that comes not from answers, but from alignment. The story had not ended. It had changed shape, becoming something shared, something lived. And somewhere beyond the reach of memory and time, in the everyday choices of people who would never know his name or hers, kindness continued its quiet work. In that ongoing motion, Keanu Reeves found the truest form of peace, knowing that what mattered most had never been about being remembered, but about helping the world remember how to care.